Hi everyone, my name is Jeff Reed. My wife Robin and I own and operate Reedfly Farm next to Yellowstone Park. And this is our English setter. Shadow, come here. Come here. Oh, come on up. Oh, say hi. Can you say hi? Look at the camera. Okay. He wanted a guest appearance. Okay, go see mom. Go get your mom. I grew up here hiking and foraging on the land, hoping to someday be a son of the wilderness like the early trappers called the Native Americans who lived here long before we did. I decided to put together this video on the greater Yellowstone area for our guests who stay at our Riverside Lodge or our mountain cabins. We get a lot of questions from our guests as to where they'll be staying and what to do in the area. It can be pretty intimidating to kind of figure out your own itinerary. And while our website answers most of those questions, some of our guests have asked us for more details on the history, the people, and the place of this special area in the United States called Yellowstone. So I've tried to condense hours and hours and hours of lectures and content I give down to less than an hour. It's a crash course organized into who, what, and where, except that we're going to do it in reverse order, starting with where. You can fast forward or skip sections as we put a table of contents for you in the text below this video. For those of you who have reserved one of our tours or educational experiences, this video is a must-see because we're going to take you to many of the off-the-tourist track spots we discuss in this video. Those sights and sounds will mean so much more if you can put them into the narrative I'll be weaving here for you. So let's get going. I want to begin with this photo in 1871, a famous one, by William Henry Jackson during what was called the Hayden Expedition. It was the first formal government expedition to get through Yellowstone Park. The government had already tried from the south in 1859 under Captain Reynolds using Jim Bridger as a guide, but they were turned back by snow. So the Hayden Expedition made it via the north, where they camped here and took this photo of Emigrant Peak. Here's a photo from Reedfly's back door, a little closer to the river than where they camped, and next to one of the first homes in the area called Bottler's. A year prior to the 1871 government-funded expedition, some enterprising individuals had already toured the area. This included Nathaniel Langford, one of the early Montana vigilante leaders and a hired consultant for the railroad consultant. Langford had an article published about their tour in a popular U.S. magazine called Scribner's Monthly. The title, called The Wonders of Yellowstone, really put Yellowstone on the map, literally. Here's a copy of the original 1871 book that you can check out when you're here, and the actual beginning of the article. Others had tried to publish similar accounts, but no one really believed the stories. Langford was successful, however, and his goal was more entrepreneurial because he was trying to figure out ways to promote tourism in the area so that he could finish a railroad through the area. Hayden's 1871 expedition was more erudite, including Hayden himself, who was a geologist in charge of the United States Geological and Geographical Survey of the territories. He brought with him an experienced photographer, the most prolific first photographer of Yellowstone, William Henry Jackson, and the renowned artist Thomas Moran, and an ensemble of who's who from Eastern Ivy League schools. Langford, who was representing industry, and Hayden, representing science and art, joined forces to lobby Congress to set aside this special place they had seen. And in 1872, Congress did just that, establishing Yellowstone National Park. In fact, Thomas Moran was commissioned by Congress to paint this scene of the Yellowstone Grand Canyon, which Robin and I visited at the Smithsonian National Gallery of Art last year. Here she is pointing up at this massive painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone by Thomas Moran. So let's start with the where and give you a sense of the place that we're in. So here's a map of the Earth, and there's Reedfly Farm in Yellowstone National Park. We're right on close to the eastern front of the Rocky Mountains. If we zoom in on that map, you'll see the Yellowstone Plateau. You'll see all those mountain ranges, the green forests, and the conifers. You get some detail of where we're located. And here we are sitting in Paradise Valley, which one author, Thomas Wolfe, called nude spaciousness. It's probably my favorite description of the place. This finger-like valley floor crawls its way gently into Yellowstone National Park. Hence, it was the path chosen by so many from the past to get to the park. The area around Yellowstone Park is often referred to as the Greater Yellowstone and is comprised of federally protected national forests, wilderness areas, and additional national parks that more than double the size of Yellowstone National Park. And this particular map gives you a sense. Everywhere you see those mountains and the green around it is the Greater Yellowstone. Here's Yellowstone National Park, and then there's the Greater Yellowstone I was talking about. One thing that is hard to appreciate about Yellowstone is the lack of human development, at least for now. This map does a great job. It shows road concentrations in the lower 48. The darker the lines, the more the roads. So New York, LA, Chicago, they all stand out. This is Yellowstone, though. Very few roads and very few city lights. Here's a photo from the International Space Station. You see Bozeman and Livingston are here, Jackson Hole down here, Gardner here, and here we are. All of this dark in that space is the Greater Yellowstone. Let's zoom even further into Yellowstone and look at it like a human would in 3 dimensions and up close. So we're looking south right now from Reedfly Farm. Here are the roads you'll be driving and some of the landmarks for orientation. Mammoth Hot Springs, Old Faithful, Yellowstone Lake, Grand Canyon, and Lamar Valley. Those are names you should know. Here you drive to Mammoth Hot Springs your first day, over to Old Faithful and all of the geysers, over and around Yellowstone Lake, through the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, and back. And usually on your first day or on your third day, you take a drive through Lamar Valley up to Cook City and on top of the Beartooth Pass, which is one of my favorite places and my childhood playground. Here's a view of that same scene from on top of a mountain by one of our cabins, way up high. It's looking south at the same mountain range you're seeing in the drawing. So that's the where. Here are some of the highlights of Yellowstone. Entering Yellowstone Lake, right there in the middle of the screen, are more than 141 tributaries, but only one river. That river, Yellowstone River, flows north outside the park and right by your back door at Reedfly Farm. The Greater Yellowstone is roughly 35,000 square miles. It's one of the largest nearly intact temperate zone ecosystems on Earth. 11,000 years ago, humans first came to this area. White people only show up in numbers 150 years ago with trapping, mining, railroad, tourism, and ag development. The largest known volcano is here. Most of the park is above 7,500 feet in elevation, and that volcano sits underneath it. It contains half of the world's active geysers. It's the second highest lake, over 7,000 feet. Has the largest concentration of wildlife in the lower 48. The largest free-roaming wild herd of bison in the United States, one of the largest elk herds in North America, and one of the few grizzly bear populations in the contiguous United States. The thermal files you find in the hot springs are studied to understand early life. It's the source of the longest undammed river in the lower 48, the Yellowstone River. And like we already mentioned, it's the world's first national park, established in 1872 after the 1871 Hayden expedition. A lot of people come to the park to see animals, lions, tigers, and bears. Even though there aren't lions and tigers anymore, there used to be actually here. But here are some of the animals people love to see. Bears. On the left is a grizzly bear eating on a bison carcass, and on the right with a cub is a black bear. Here are elk, 2 female elk called cow elk, and a bull elk. Here are wolves and coyote. Wolves on the left, a coyote with a vole in its mouth on the right. Deer. 2 species of deer. On the left, mule deer, and on the right, a whitetail. Bison or buffalo. Bighorn sheep. And antelope, the fastest land animal in North America. But it's more than just seeing the animals. Sometimes you see what they left behind. In this particular case, we were on a hike last summer, and if you look close enough, you'll see the paw prints of a bear walking down this dead tree. Here's one of them to give you a hint. People also come here to fish. The fish of Yellowstone National Park in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming include 13 native fish species and 6 introduced or non-native species. Angling for trout has been a pastime in the park since its creation, and trout species dominate the fish inhabiting the park. When Yellowstone was first created, 40% of the park's waters were barren of fish, including most of the alpine lakes and rivers above major waterfalls. Only 17 of the 150 lakes held fish in it. Here are the fish native to the park. The famous cutthroat trout, there in the top left. Underneath it, grayling. 2 species of sucker at the bottom, and the whitefish. Here are non-native species. You might be surprised that rainbow trout aren't native. Brook trout, the top, brown trout, and underneath it, lake trout. You can keep these fish when you're fishing in the park up to a certain limit. In fact, some of the species you're required to actually kill because they're invasive species and impacting the native species. This lake trout, for example, when it was opened up, had over 30 cutthroat trout in its stomach, and they've decimated the native species of cutthroat trout in the park, and the Park Service is working to restore them. Nearly 300 bird species have been sighted in Yellowstone National Park, including raptors, songbirds, shorebirds, and waterfowl. Here's a handful that you can keep your eyes out for. One of the most beautiful is the bluebird. We have boxes all around the farm that house the bluebirds when they come and nest. Bald eagles, here's one taking a duck off a lake. The Clark's nutcracker. These guys are amazing. They have excellent spatial memory, which enables them to cache up to 30,000 seeds in the fall, generally pine nuts, and then they locate a large percentage of those during the winter, allowing them to overwinter. These caches are generally buried in the soil on exposed slopes and they often find their caches up to 9 months later where they put them in the ground. They're not 100% efficient at finding them, which then, of course, allows for seed dispersal and for the propagation of the trees. Probably one of my favorite birds, one of the corvids, the black-billed magpie, also known as the American magpie, is widely considered one of the most intelligent animals in the world, and one of only a few non-mammal species able to recognize itself in a mirror. 2 of our other favorite birds and corvids in the area are crows and ravens. I've tracked ravens on a GPS collar going from Yellowstone Lake to nearby the lodge where they fed on a carcass, and they would go back to roost each night at Yellowstone Lake and come back here in the morning. It's about an 80-mile round trip. Sandhill cranes nest in Yellowstone each summer. If you come in September, you'll hear their guttural calls from our lodge. They're the tallest birds in Yellowstone. They stand about 4 feet high, and they have wingspans of approximately 6.5 feet. Here's an osprey taking a trout off the water. You'll see them nesting nearby the lodge, and you'll most likely see them flying outside your door or while you're down on the river fishing. Here's a dusky grouse. It's a species of forest-dwelling grouse that feeds on pine needles in the winter. It's one of Shiloh's favorite birds to hunt. Of course, we can't hunt them in the park. Here's a golden eagle. They're huge, massive birds. They feed on grouse, small mammals, rabbits, marmots, ground squirrels, and carrion. There's been surveys in the park that located 28 golden eagles across different parts of the park, 20 within the northern range alone. We'll be looking for them, and typically you look way up in the sky to find them. Another one of my favorite birds is the black-capped chickadee. It's a small, non-migratory North American songbird that lives in deciduous and mixed forests. They keep us company all winter long. In fact, one's outside right now playing with Shiloh, and they're often very tame, and they'll feed from your hand. It's well known for its capability to lower its body temperature during cold winter nights, as well as its good spatial memory to relocate the caches where it stores food, and its boldness near humans. They have many calls, including the one that gives them their name, the chickadee. They'll add multiple D's to the end of that call, chickadee, D, D, D. And the more they add, the more severity of danger they're trying to signal to their peers in the area, whether it be a hawk a long ways away or a bobcat walking in the hidden underbrush. Here's a picture of ravens that have been GPS collared and how they disperse in and around the park. So the park's down here in the middle, and each one of these pink dots are locations they were found at. It gives you a sense of how far these birds roam away from a certain region. There's the tracking of the bird that I was talking about that would roost at Yellowstone Lake and come near the lodge to feed on a cow carcass that had died near our place. Here's a color-coded map of all the conifers in Yellowstone Park. You'll notice in the northern range close to Reedfly, there are fewer conifers than in the central and southern region of the park. We're going to teach you how to identify the different species from their needles. Two of my favorite, the lodgepole pine and the whitebark pine. In green, you'll see the lodgepole pine, and you'll notice that they dominate Yellowstone Park. It's where they get their name, being used for teepees. The tall, thin trees that you see poking out of the top of a teepee is a lodgepole pine. They prefer the acidic soil that was created when the Yellowstone volcano erupted, which occupies most of the central part of the park. My other favorite tree, the whitebark pine, is shown here in yellow. It's disappearing. Remember the Clark's nutcracker who feeds on the nuts? By the way, they're probably the tastiest pine nut you'll ever eat. Well, grizzly bears depend upon them as well. In fact, if you look at the foods that a grizzly bear prefers or eats, after grasses and ants, whitebark pine are the third top food source of grizzlies. Like I mentioned, they're in decline due to disease and warming climates because they prefer high elevation, cold locations. Let's talk about plants. Now, obviously there are a lot of plants in Yellowstone Park, so we can't even cover a fraction of them. Before you come here, make sure you download the iPhone or Android app called Flora of Yellowstone by my friend Whitney Tilt. You can use it without cell coverage as you try to identify the various plants in the area. Here's just a few to whet your appetite. Here's a flax. Here are the lodgepole pine we mentioned. Here are the whitebark pine. You can see the thicker, broader tops than the lodgepole pine. Indian paintbrush, shooting stars, Lewis monkey flower, which Meriwether Lewis named. The bitterroot, which is the Montana state flower. Here's an aspen, and if you look close enough, you'll see the claws of a bear climbing up this tree. And here's a special plant. It's Ross's bentgrass. It grows only in the geyser basins in the Firehole River drainage and at Shoshone Geyser Basin. Even within the thermal areas of Yellowstone's geyser basins, the right conditions to support this grass are rare and highly scattered. The thermal habitats are distinguished primarily by their elevated soil temperatures, right? They're hotter, they're warmer, and this helps this plant survive. As a result, it's one of the first plants to green up in warm pockets, sometimes as early as January. Here's a yucca. You wouldn't think that we have these in Yellowstone National Park. We have some right outside the door at Reedfly Farm. When they're in full bloom, we'll use the flowers in a recipe, a Mexican recipe that includes omelets. And then one of my favorite plants is bistort. It has a root that's very edible, and here we are cooking some of them up outside the lodge that we picked up in the higher elevation of the Absarokas. Plants were used extensively as cordage by First Peoples. Here you see some string and rope and different objects. These are from Mummy Cave, which we'll talk about. On the left, we think this might have been a snare from over 500 years ago. In the middle is a broom, a different type of broom for sweeping. And then on the right is actually the original Dr. Scholl's. It was actually a moccasin liner. It would be put inside of moccasins to keep your feet warmer. We're going to teach you how to make your own cordage using what's called a 2-ply S or Z twist while you're here. Let me take an aside and talk to you about this person right here, Truman Everts. Here's another one of my favorite plants. It's called Everts thistle, also known as elk thistle. Truman became famous as a member of the 1870 Washburn-Langford Doan expedition I mentioned earlier. They described and mapped the area as they came through before the official government expedition. Everts wandered away from the expedition near Yellowstone Lake, lost his pack horse, and spent 37 days lost in the Yellowstone wilderness. After he lost his supplies, he survived by eating native plants, including large amounts of this elk thistle. His party searched for him for a while and eventually left. Nice friends. And they offered a reward of $600 to find him. Well, a guy named Jack Barnett and George Pritchett found Everts near Blacktail Deer Creek, which we'll pass by, suffering from frostbite and burn wounds from thermal vents. Despite eating the native plant he was named after, he was so malnourished that he supposedly only weighed about 50 pounds when they found him. One of the rescuers stayed with him to nurse him back to health, while the other walked 75 miles for help. And in the end, the two rescuers were denied the reward money because Everts claimed he would have made it out of the mountains on his own. The year following his misadventure, he wrote an account of his experiences, and his story was published in the same year of Scribner's as the Langford article in 1871. After the fame from his article, most people don't know that Everts was offered the position of first superintendent of the newly established Yellowstone National Park, but he declined. He wasn't that smart of a guy, since it did not include a salary. He later moved to Hyattsville, Maryland, and worked in the U.S. Post Office. He died there in 1901 in his home of pneumonia. Here's an elk thistle. We'll find some of them while you're here. And here we've taken its root out of the earth and we scrape down the sides, and we often will use these as celery sticks. They taste just like celery, and they're hollow in the center, and they're perfect for a Bloody Mary. And here's Robin eating one of the elk thistle from a Bloody Mary that we had with some of our guests. And here's the mountain named after Truman Everett's Peak near Rescue Creek, falsely named as the place they found him. They didn't find him here, but we'll drive right by this mountain. We'll see if you recognize it when you see it. So let's talk about the geology of the park. Most people, when they think of geology of Yellowstone, they think of this. Here's Woody Harrelson in the movie 2012 as Yellowstone volcano erupts, and Woody's extremely happy now because he's going to go out with a bang. But the geology of the park is much more complex than just the volcano. And we can't. The geology of the greater Yellowstone is so complex and would take forever to actually cover in detail. But I really want to give you a crash course because it's all around you while you're here. So having some understanding of the history through time of the geology, it'll help you appreciate what you're looking at. Here's a series of maps of North America over time from roughly 500 million years ago to present. And over there on the right in the red stars, you'll see where Yellowstone Park is. This is the last 50,000 years of the life on the planet. And they'll be pretty familiar to you, right? North America, here's when you could cross the Bering Land Bridge. The next one over is the Great Ice Age. And the last one is modern North America. So that's pretty straightforward and simple. But if you go back in time 3 billion years ago, there are actually rocks in Yellowstone Park, some of the oldest rocks in the world that go back to 3 billion years old. And then you'll have this huge gap in the geological record where there's no rock until you get to about 500 million years ago. And around then, if you look on the North American continent, you'll see that Yellowstone Park was often underwater. So you have these shallow seas, deeper seas, and then the land would go above sea level and they would reside and flux back and forth. And so you get a lot of this sea life in the fossil record that shows up. And then later on, you get even shallower seas, and then you get these inland seas that wrap around, and that's where you'll see the dinosaurs existing. And then later on, you get these volcanoes that are very similar to the Cascade Mountains, like Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier, that were all around us in Paradise Valley. And then you start seeing the formation of what looks a little more like North America. If we go back in time to when we were in shallow seas, you'll see this sort of geology where you have limestone formations and lots of fossils that show up. Here's a fossil that I found in a limestone formation way up at like 9,000 feet elevation of what's called a horned coral. If we fast forward from that roughly 500 million year time frame to the Cretaceous, let's say 100 million years later, there's a place called Devil's Slide that we're going to drive by. And when you see it here, it's a bunch of these rock layers that are showing up vertically, and all you got to do is flip it on its side, and those are rock layers from that cover about 350 million years old. The oldest rock is on the left and the youngest rock on the right. This structure, this rock formation, was actually the first described wonder of Yellowstone National Park. And here's a drawing of it in that Scribner's monthly article. And so if you think about it, the first thing that the world saw was this Devil's Slide, and yet it's not in Yellowstone National Park proper. It's about 10 miles from Reedfly Farm. If we fast forward to the dinosaur age, there were T-Rexes roaming across Montana. Here's a picture of one of the most famous T-Rexes, which is now in the Smithsonian Fossil Hall. And Robin and I got to go see it last year with our friends Kirk and Chase. Kirk runs the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. And so these dinosaurs were roaming all across Montana. And like I said, we had these inland seas that kind of surrounded us on both sides. Fast forward to the Eocene era, roughly 50 million years ago, you have these monster petrified forests. We're one of the largest petrified forests in the world right here. And the elevation of the mountains were really high, and down low was more tropical weather. So way up high you have these conifers, and down lower you have more hardwoods, and even there's breadfruit like you find in tropical climates way down low. And when these volcanoes would erupt, they'd be like Mount St. Helens, where you'd have this snow slush just run down the mountain in this mud and picking up all these trees and depositing them down low. And these trees would re-stand up through their root balls straight up. And here you have a picture of one of them standing erect, petrified after all of these years. There's places we'll take you to where you can even do a self-guided hike and walk through these trees. If we fast forward even more forward to 16 million years ago, this is a really important map. The Yellowstone volcano, which you see over there on the right in southwest Montana, actually has been moving and started over in southeastern Oregon. What's really happening is the continental plate of North America is moving westward, and the magma plume is staying in place. And so over time, it shows up in different locations across the United States. So in the trajectory it's going right now, it'll be somewhere up in North Dakota in the future. So over 16 million years, you see where these eruptions have taken place, but in different places of what we would call modern America. In this time period, roughly 5 million years ago, you start seeing what we'd call a modern horse-looking creature, although they're smaller. And that's a cool thing to remember, is that, we had camels here, horses here, elephants, lions, and tigers. Here's a picture of one of the horses found in one of the Miocene layers. It's kind of this grayish clay cliff area on Hepburn's Mesa, which is literally, I can see it outside of my window. They found one of these horses there, and gives you another sense of how we had these animals and creatures here that are no longer here. In fact, horses disappeared, and when humans first came to North America, there weren't horses here until the Spanish brought them 500 years ago. And then if we fast forward to roughly 1.5 million to 2 million years ago, we come to what we would know as modern Yellowstone. And here's a picture of Yellowstone Park in 3 dimensions with the mountains surrounding it. And there's the Yellowstone caldera I mentioned right in the middle. And it'll be a good trick for you while you're driving through the park to see if you can identify the caldera as you drive from one location to another, because you'll be driving into the caldera as you drive through Yellowstone Park. And then, of course, the glacial ice age. Here's a massive boulder that was deposited on the rim of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone by a glacier. It didn't just show up there, and we'll stop there at Inspiration Point to see it. And then, of course, we fast forward to roughly 15,000 years ago, when humans first come to North America, and the animals that they would have seen when they got here. So that's, a huge amount of geology crashed into just a few minutes of time, but it'll give you a sense for all of the mountains and the mountain ranges and the rock structures you see while you're here. The geology most of you are familiar with in Yellowstone has to do with the volcano. Yellowstone was set aside as the world's first national park in large part because of its hydrothermal wonders. It contains 10,000 thermal features, including the world's greatest concentration of geysers in the world, as well as hot springs, mud pots, and steam vents. These concentrated areas are represented on the map here. You'll see the caldera of the volcanic eruption there in the middle, and then the red areas are where you have these high concentrations of thermal features. Some of the features you'll see in the park include geysers, such as Old Faithful, and this picture of the tallest geyser, Steamboat Geyser, periodically erupt in scalding hot water. This is due to increased pressure exerted by the rock overlaying the water coming up from the ground, as well as the water on top of the water down below. It prevents it from boiling, and as this hot water rises, it's under less pressure, and so those steam bubbles start to form because there's less pressure, and in turn they expand on their ascent until the bubbles are too big and numerous to pass freely through these constrictions that are going through the rock. At a critical point in time, the bubbles actually lift the water above and out, causing the geyser to splash or overflow, and the decrease in the pressure of the system and boiling results. So you have these large flashes of water coming out of the ground, and then it's going back down into the ground until that pressure builds back up. Another geothermal feature are fumaroles or steam vents. They're the hottest hydrothermal feature in the park, and they have so little water that it all flashes into steam before reaching the surface. And at places like Roaring Mountain here, the result is a loud hissing of steam and gases, and you'll drive right by this thermal feature. Hot springs such as Grand Prismatic, that shows up in photos all over the world, are the most common hydrothermal feature in the park. Their plumbing has no constrictions like a geyser does, and so the water reaches the surface, sinks, and is replaced by hot water from below. Mud pots, one of my favorites, such as this one called fountain paint pots. They're very acidic hot springs with a limited water supply. They smell like hydrogen sulfide or that rotten egg smell, and the water comes up through the earth and breaks down the rock and minerals around it, and you get this bubbling, gray, muddish looking feature. And then the travertine terraces at Mammoth. These are nearest to Reedfly Farm, and they're formed from limestone, which is way underneath the earth. And these thermal waters rise through the limestone carrying high amounts of dissolved carbonates. So carbon dioxide is released at the surface, and calcium carbonate deposits and builds up layer after layer, including 3 millimeters a day. And so you can imagine how fast these terraces build up. And they build up and then collapse on themselves and push the water to a new area. So when you see Mammoth, you'll see all of this gray area and then active areas. And that's because they've collapsed on themselves, the water has found a new way out, and you'll see these active areas with the bright orange and brown colors. And of course, there's waterfalls. Yellowstone Park has at least 45 named waterfalls and cascades, and hundreds more unnamed, and even undiscovered waterfalls that keep showing up. The highest plunge type waterfall in the park is the lower falls of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone at 308 feet, and the highest horse sail type, which is this one in the bottom right, is called Silver Cord Cascade at 1,200 feet. So we've looked at where, we've looked at what, which is often why people come to Yellowstone Park, but what about the who? What about the people and their lifestyles? This is one of my favorite topics, Yellowstone. So who were the first immigrants? Well, you first have to realize that for more than 11,000 years, people have been in this area. That's back when mammoths roamed this area. So if we start at the bottom of this chart and go back 11,000 years, there's a place called the Anzac site, which is discovered about 30 miles from Reedfly. It used to be the oldest human remains found in North America, and that's about 11,000 years ago. There's a Clovis point from this period made from obsidian at Obsidian Cliff, which we'll talk about a little later. Folsom people were in the Yellowstone area as early as 10,900 years ago. 9,000 years ago, there were sites on the shore of Yellowstone Lake. Multiple points have been traced back to there, including they'll have remains of blood on them from rabbits, from dogs, from deer and bighorn sheep. People seem to have occupied this site for short seasonal periods, but they were here a long time ago. From 8,000 to 1,500 years ago, people leave traces of camps all along Yellowstone Lake. 7,000 years ago is the vegetation we see similar to what we find today. Again, projectile points start to be notched at this time frame, and it's one way these projectile points, these stone points, and how they were made is how we determine the time frame that we find them in. 3,000 years ago, oral histories of the Salish people placed their ancestors in Yellowstone area. 1,500 years ago, the bow and arrow begins to displace the atlatl, a throwing spear. We find sheep traps in the mountains and bison corrals on the plains. 500 to 1700 AD. In 1400, there are oral histories of the Kiowa placed their ancestors in the Yellowstone area. 1450, we have this tiny little ice age that becomes important. In the 1600s, North American tribes in the Southwest begin acquiring horses. Ancestors of the Crow may have come into Yellowstone during this time. In the 1700s, Lakota Sioux begin exploring the Yellowstone area. In the late 1700s, fur traders start traveling in this area. And then in 1804, Lewis and Clark shows up. John Coulter tours, trappers show up, and then you start having the immigrants and homesteaders show up until today. So again, that's almost like the geology crushed down 10,000 years of human history crushed down into a few minutes. It's hard to cover it all. But I really want to emphasize that if you go back in time to that 11,000 years ago, here's a cave called Mummy Cave. It's on the eastern edge of Yellowstone Park, and it was occupied by humans for over 10,000 years. They've dug down into the earth column and discovered human remains, all sorts of tools, projectile points going back to 10,000 years ago. And if we go back in that time, here's the Anzac cache I talked about earlier. All of these amazing, huge bifaces this big. That's how big some of these tools were and these antler spears that were used by early peoples as they were roaming this place along with mammoth, saber-toothed tigers, and other things. Like this thing, right? One of the creatures that would have been walking through this area, a massive armadillo. And then if there's one place you have to see in Yellowstone Park, I know not a lot of people talk about it, but it's Obsidian Cliff. And we're going to talk about how this one rock formation was so valued and prized by thousands and thousands of years of humans all across North America. Most of the first peoples you'll be familiar with look like encampments like this with teepees. But these are fairly recent inventions. Here's an encampment from Absaluka, or often spelled Absaroka for the Crow Indians. And Absaroka are the names of the mountain range that look out our back door. Here's a Blackfeet encampment. Here's a Nez Perce encampment. And here's a Shoshone encampment. Shoshone comes from the word Shoshone, a Shoshone word for high-growing grasses. Some neighboring tribes called the Shoshone the grass house people based on their traditional homes made from this grass. All four of each of these tribal peoples used the greater Yellowstone in different capacities and lived in different parts of it at different times of the year. Here's two teepee rings that you can go see to this day near the north entrance of Yellowstone Park, and we'll go see them on our tour. Often in the center of these rock rings are fire pits or hearths where you'd cook and you'd keep warm. Here's the inside of a teepee showing cooking and sleeping areas from an unknown photographer in the 1870s. And here's my friend George Buman, an amazing sculptor and naturalist of the greater Yellowstone area. And we'd found this hearth eroding out of a bank of the river, and you could see the ash around these rocks. You could see the fire-cracked rocks that had been placed around a fire pit, just like you'd see today. And often in these areas, you'll find lithic remains, you'll find remains of bones, and plants that were cooked during that period. There's so much more to Native Americans than teepees, though. Some didn't even use teepees much at all. And my favorite group are called the Tugudika, eaters of sheep meat, or sheep eaters as they're oftenly called. As their namesake implies, bighorn sheep were very important to their lifestyle. And on your tour through Yellowstone, we'll stop at, here's a picture of Sheep Eater Cliff, named by Norris. And it's near one of the superintendents of the park. It's near Indian Creek, which was named by the Hayden expedition due to the travois marks left by the side of the trail. And travois are what you would attach to horses or dogs to almost as a backpack to them that you would tow along the ground. It's like a wagon without wheels. The descendants of the sheep eaters now live with the Eastern Shoshone tribe on the Wind River Reservation and the Bannock tribe at Fort Hall Reservation. They left many signs behind, and here are just a few. They would actually use these fence lines made from logs to herd bighorn sheep into this round circular pen that they would run and jump in, but they couldn't get out of. And then they would club them and kill them and use the meat and everything from them to produce goods. Here's a bow that they would make from the horns of a bighorn sheep. And here's a famous guy out of near Jackson Hole making a sheep eater bow from a bighorn sheep horn. And it's a long, lengthy process. You can go watch it on YouTube, but it's amazing the strength of these bows. I have one, and you can take a look at it when you come here. The strength of these bows and how short they were. Mine's like 22 inches long, and you can hunt with them easily. Here's a kind of a rock cairn that would be used to up on high, high mountains where the bighorn sheep would be, and you would hide behind these cairns and, you know, shoot at bighorn sheep. And these are like at 10,000 feet that you find these today. And here's one in the side of kind of a cliff face where you dig out the rock and then you would go crawl down in there, and people might herd the sheep up these rock cliffs because they didn't like to get into the conifers because cougars and other predators would be in there. And so they would rock up these rock faces, and you would hide down, duck down in these pits and sit up and shoot the bighorn with your bow there. They didn't use horses that much or at all. It's not clear, but we know when they were in the park they didn't have horses when they were found. And they did use dogs though. And here's a dog with a travois carrying goods across a landscape from the 1870s. So this is what you can kind of imagine they were using, you know, maybe even as early as 10,000 years ago. In fact, here are some skulls of dogs up out of Alaska that I took a photo of and was visiting this winter. And they're 5,000-year-old skulls of dogs on a remote island up there, and gives you a sense of how important dogs were to first peoples as they came into North America. Here's some stone pots called steatite pots or soapstone pots. You've probably heard of soapstone. It's a fairly soft stone that you can actually cut through even using stone tools. And on the right there, you can see the remains of these forms of pots that were being carved out of a soapstone rock structure. And so eventually those balls you were seeing would be cut out. And then on the left there, you see the different pot shapes that they would grind out the center of. And you could use those pots, stick them in a hearth, boil water, cook Bistorte nuts, make broth, soups, those sorts of things with it. Probably my favorite tool or thing to search for in the greater Yellowstone are stone tools that have been left behind. Here's a photo of a beautiful quartz arrowhead that a friend of mine found while we were way up in the Absaroka Mountains hiking at about 9,000 feet up at the top of a mountain. Often what you find are just the remains of the stone tools. We call it knapping, and those remains are often called debitage. And here's a bunch of different flakes that we found, rock flakes, and just set them in a log to admire the different colors that you could get from them. You can spend a lifetime learning about stone technology. In fact, the earliest stone tools currently discovered go back 3.3 million years ago, well prior to modern Homo sapiens. Here's a poster of just a handful of the different types of stone points made in North America, different forms, shapes, utility purposes that they were made for. And you can often date the time period that you find the stone tool by the type of tool that was found. Most of them had utilitarian purposes, but some of them had some sort of religious purpose or ceremonial purpose, or just were works of art. If you want, I'll show you or teach you how to knap your own arrowhead while you're here. Here's a couple of the knives I've got. Actually, some of them are sitting right here. For example, here's a knife blade that you see on the screen, and a ring I made from an antler using those knives to just carve out an antler horn and then drill down into it. Here's a piece of obsidian, and this was used as a knife to carve that knife. And remember, I mentioned the soapstone. That's what you're seeing there, is just a little carve out emblem of Immigrant Peak, and that was carved with this same knife. So it's actually soft enough to cut with a stone blade. And it's often talked about how obsidian is so sharp, it's 1 atom thick, it's sharper than steel in any knife you could get, that it's often used in surgery because it's so sharp. And like I mentioned before, this is a picture of Obsidian Cliff. And in my opinion, it's the one must see in Yellowstone Park. Not Old Faithful, not the Grand Canyon. This cliff, which is filled with that obsidian rock all over it and on top and laying on the ground, was so important to First Peoples in North America. It's been traded as far east as Ohio and turned into these grand ceremonial objects. So we'll stop there. You can see it, the road goes right by it, and people just cruise on by without understanding the importance of the history of that site. The Native Americans weren't just about hunting and killing and spear throwing and bows and arrows, although things like the bison were extremely important to their livelihood. And here you have a recreation of what's called a buffalo jump. And when you drive into Reedfly, you'll be driving right past a buffalo jump that was used for thousands of years. And it's a basalt formation similar looking to this one of a lava flow from 2 million years ago. But these animals were used not just for food, but they were used for clothing. And some of the most beautiful clothing ever made, in my opinion. Here are some awls or needles that were found in this area. And for example, here's one I found. It gives you a sense of the size. And this was used to puncture through the thick hide of a bison or a sheep or a deer and make things like this. It's a beautiful Late Plains Indian dress. Courtesy of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you can go see this particular dress there. And on the left hip, you can see an object similar to this beaded long object hanging down from the hip. And that was an awl holder. And here's a needle I made from a cannon bone of a deer. similar to that one. But as you can tell, you wouldn't walk around, all day to pull out your needle. You made this as decoration to a dress. You made it as artwork to something that you were proud of and recognized for. And this right here is a very unique object that someone in Anchorage, Alaska showed to me. I'd never seen it before, but it gives you a sense for the pride of these people. But this is actually the fetus of a bison cow that was taken from the cow after it was killed and turned into what's called a puberty robe. And it would be put on a girl when she was presented to her husband in certain tribes. And each of those red lines going down, those were needlework and beadwork, represented the buffalo that were killed that year by that family. And someday when you're here, I'll tell you a story about this grizzly bear. It's an amazing photo taken by Tom Murphy and how it's related to that puberty robe. It's an amazing story, and it's hidden in this picture somewhere. You'll have to come and visit to see it. The beginning of the end of that era of Native Americans happened before this time, but you may remember this particular map, and it's kind of the most emblematic of a shift in time frames from the past to the present, and that's the Lewis and Clark journey. Here's the map that Lewis and Clark produced on their journey from the West Coast and back. And you can see their route up from St. Louis up the Missouri, across the Rockies, over to the Pacific Ocean, and then their route back. On their route back, they split up near Bozeman, and Lewis took the same way back that they came, and Clark went across the Bozeman Pass, now the Bozeman Pass, camped right near Livingston at Billman Creek. You crossed it when you came through Livingston and come down to Reedfly Farm, and then met back up with Lewis at the Missouri River. And you can see Reedfly Farm there roughly based on their map. One of the Lewis and Clark crew decided to turn back near North Dakota and explore the upper Yellowstone. His name was John Coulter, and he may have been the first white person to see what became Yellowstone Park. He made his living as a trapper. And really it was trapping the early 1800s were dominated by trappers coming to the area. And if you want to read just one book on Yellowstone, just one, read the one by this guy, Osborne Russell. There's a book written in 1834 called Journal of a Trapper. He wrote this when he had hiked north of Yellowstone and stopped near our mountain cabin property in Tom Minor. William Clark had commented on the abundance of fur-bearing animals in the area, quote, saying, "The Yellowstone and its tributaries abound in beaver and otter." Jim Bridger was a famous trapper and mountain man. He claimed to have wintered in 1844 in Paradise Valley. He was accompanied by Crow Indians. They left a large pile of deer, antelope, and elk and buffalo skulls as a monument to their sojourn. In the years that followed, large ranches took hold in Paradise Valley, such as the notable one, the Nelson Story Ranch, who allegedly became the inspiration for Larry McCurdy's Pulitzer Prize-winning epic, Lonesome Dove. But the trappers really dominated before the ranchers and the miners. Johnston Gardner, an old trapper in the upper Yellowstone during the 1830s, is the town's namesake. One of the first written accounts of our area is from Osborne Russell in 1835. And here he wrote, "On the 25th of August, I left the defile and took up the Gallatin in east direction, crossed the mountain and fell on a stream running into the Yellowstone, and finding no beaver, returned to the Gallatin the next day." He penned that right by our cabins near Tom Minor. So what was trapping? Is it hunting? Is it agriculture? Is it survival? Just like the Native Americans, it was all of the above. And it was the closest that Europeans came, in my opinion, to living in the area without the trappings of its eastern neighbors' creature comforts. Thankfully, trapping is not widely practiced today, but I admired this early sojourner, and they loved this place too. After moving back east later in his life, Osborne Russell deeply missed the self-reliance and rhythm of the life he found in the wilderness. He also deeply admired the Native Americans he encountered. I loved what he called the Shoshone people, quote, sons of the wilderness. In 1860s, the newcomers really started to appear. After trapping as an industry died off, the California gold rush brought new people out west. Thomas B. Curry and his two companions discovered placers for gold in Paradise Valley in the summer of 1863. They were some of the first white men to visit the area. The three men were preparing to start work in the gulch when they were interrupted by a party of Crow Indians who ordered them off the land. Curry and his companions left the gulch, spent the winter at Virginia City, and returned the next year. In late August 1864, they were joined by a party of 30 men from a wagon train that Jim Bridger was guiding up the Yellowstone along the Bozeman Trail. Jim Bridger had wintered there, like I said, in 1844 and left a mark for those early immigrants to find. On your left is a map of the streets they marked out as they built the town that you see on the right. That town is near Chico Hot Springs, and you can see where it once was right across the river from Reedfly. Like I mentioned, the Crow Indian claimed this entire region, and when the first survey map was created that Reedfly now sits on the west side of the river were all the surveys, and on the east side of the river, the tax parcels essentially on the west side of the river. On the east side of the river, all it says on our first survey in the deed of our property is the Crow Nation. They owned everything on the east side of the river at the time. These first people were involved in mining. These first immigrants were involved in mining, commercial hunting. Here's a picture of the Bottler Ranch, and all of those skins on the side of that building there are elk skins. So that was a commercial hunting enterprise. And when you're here, I'll show you this photo up close, but standing next to this man in the middle, this little kind of gray and white dot is actually a baby antelope on a leash. And then on the right, agriculture. This is a big ranching valley. My neighbors are ranchers. I love them to death. They keep this place wide open for future generations instead of developed and subdeveloped. Fishing was even big back then. It's huge today ever since river runs through it, which was partly filmed in this area. Here's Thomas Moran with a huge catch of trout in a small creek over by Bozeman. And even when the tourists started coming into Yellowstone Park, here's a famous picture of someone catching a trout out of Yellowstone Lake and dipping it in a hot springs and cooking it and then eating it. That picture was by Frank Haynes, and it was a postcard collection that was famous in Yellowstone at what we call the fishing cone. We can take you there. By the way, this is not legal today. And then roads, railroads, and tourists came after those first immigrants. In fact, Rudyard Kipling talks about the extraordinary fishing on the Yellowstone when he stopped at this man's place on the left, aka Yankee Jim. Jim George was his name. He helped maintain the first road into Yellowstone Park and was later pushed out by the railroad, who built a line right by his house, as you can see right here. The railroad had money and muscle, and is seen by the still standing depot in Livingston, which was designed by the same architects that did Grand Central Station in New York City. The line was first completed from Livingston to Cinnabar in 1883, later all the way to Gardner in 1903, and then shut down in 1955. Like I mentioned, in 1889, when British author Rudyard Kipling visited Yellowstone, he decided to stop at Yankee Jim's house. Yankee Jim had a legendary toll road at the time where he was charging people to come by. So Rudyard Kipling stopped there, and here's his quote. As regarded the merits of that particular reach of the Yellowstone, Yankee Jim said it was alive with trout. It was. I fished it from noon till twilight, and the fish bit at the brown hook as though never a fat trout fly had fallen on the water. Ye gods, that was fishing. End quote. That's the same Rudyard Kipling you know of from the Jungle Book. When President Roosevelt came to the park via the rails in 1903, he asked to have the crusty Yankee Jim, who still lived in the area, come meet him. The reply to the invitation was, quote, "You know where I live, Teddy," end quote. Here's a picture of Teddy Roosevelt being accompanied by his entourage as he was walking up to Yellowstone Park. As you can see there in the front, there's a dog. Roosevelt Arch hadn't been built yet, just the framework, the lower base of it had been built, and you'll see that as you drive into the front entrance to Yellowstone Park. Today, the entourage would be more like 4,000 people with the President of the United States compared to back then when Teddy Roosevelt came by. And of course, he let the dog lead the way. I prefer Teddy's style. We'll end this trip down memory lane with an advertisement from the Northern Pacific there on the right. It came in the 1930s, soon before they shut down operations. It's one of their posters with a painting of Immigrant Peak as the train was going right by Reedfly's location. So that wraps up our history of the who, the where, and the what of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. But let's take a quick look at touring Yellowstone in a day, and really what takes at least a day and a half. A lot of people come here and say, I want to go see Yellowstone. It's impossible to see in a day, possible to see in a day and a half or in a week, as you can tell from this brief history discussion. But if you were to do it, here's the route we would tell you to take. You'd go see Mammoth, Old Faithful, Yellowstone Lake, the Grand Canyon, all in one day in this route. We call it the Grand Loop. And then you'd take a half a day or a leisurely day to take the Lamar Valley and go all the way up to Cook City and on top of Beartooth Pass and back again. Lamar Valley in this, what we call the Northern Range, has a lot fewer trees than the rest of the park area. So you'll see a lot more animals out in the open here, bears. It's where the buffalo reside. In fact, it's where the last 17 buffalo on the planet were recovered. Wild buffalo were recovered when the cavalry came in during the early days of Yellowstone National Park. So a day and a half, 2 separate days do these. If you do the day trip in the Grand Loop, you're going to want to get up really early. I'd get going at 5 o'clock. You'll get through the front entrance with no line. The animals are out in the morning. You can get to Old Faithful before the noon rush and maybe even get over to Yellowstone Lake for a great lunch at the grandest hotel, in my opinion, in the park on Yellowstone Lake. And then go see the Grand Canyon, Tower Falls, and come back to Mammoth Hot Springs, usually leaving that till the late afternoon. And then your half-day trip, like I said, will be touring through Lamar Valley up back outside of the park on top of the Beartooth Plateau. So that's the end of my presentation, and on cue, come here, say goodbye. Shiloh wanted to say goodbye to you all. And we both want to say thank you, or aho, as the crow would say thank you. And we wish you the best as you plan for your trip to Yellowstone Park, and hopefully this gave you a bunch of ideas. Email us, call us, and we'll help put together an itinerary of a lifetime as you come to see the greater Yellowstone. Say goodbye. Say goodbye.